Hi, Kiara, how are you?
Good. How are you? Happy Wednesday.
How are you
Welcome.
today? Doing well, thank you.
How many folks do you usually have in this class?
26 total usually. There are some classes where one or two cannot attend for various reasons, but usually, and we have about half undergraduate students and half graduate students, roughly speaking. Not as diverse in terms of background as a dialogue course, but engineering, science, environmental engineering, some policy and engineering intersection. So that's broadly the mix. Occasionally one or two computer science, either major or minor. And almost exactly half graduate students and half undergraduates in this class.
Oh, that's a really nice mix. Good to know I'm not the only non-engineer here.
All right. And for the in this class, undergraduate students will do war games of some sort, virtual war game, which is a bit different than, but still. And graduate students will take on a consulting role for those war games. Graduate students have their own projects that they're supposed to do, class projects. Right, let's see. Okay, so I think Bharat just confirmed that we are good to go. Bharat, would you just show yourself, just so everybody knows? So Bharat is the co-instructor, teaching assistant. He's a PhD student in my lab and also an intern at the Oak Ridge National Lab. So he's working with Dr. Forrest Hoffman in climate modeling, more specifically in climate and carbon cycle, including carbon cycle extremes, those kind of things. Okay, so with that, all that I will do is introduce our moderator, Kara. It's a pleasure for me to have Kara back. She was at Northeastern before. She's a graduate from Northeastern. And they are, so we go back a long way, starting in 2014, right? The first dialogue course. And then Kara was a mentor to some of my other dialogue courses. And then off and on. And then we have published together, including in an encyclopedia of GIS, I believe. And then Kara has been a journalist and many other things besides in terms of various kinds of work that Kara has done. So with that background, instead of me taking too much time, Kara, why don't I hand it over to you? You are the journalist here and you know all the panelists. So I see Carling Hay, Julia Hopkins, and Evan Kodra. Carling and Evan, they work at risQ, that's risQ risQ. That's the startup company. And if you are more interested, that's www.risq.io. Evan is the CEO, Carling is the lead climate scientist. Carling also used to be a faculty in Boston College, right? And then she joined risQ. She has a very interesting work on sea level rise and many other things besides. Professor Julia Hopkins is a colleague at Northeastern and in civil environmental engineering, also marine and environmental science, right? And many of you by now have heard from me about her work at Emerald 22, which is nature-inspired design for climate change and weather extremes. But we'll hear from them in terms of some of the details. I also see Lindsay Bressler here. Hi, Lindsay. So Lindsay, thanks for joining. Also, the same kind of, I mean, we go back as long as I go back with Kara. And same starting with the 2014 dialogue, both of them are working in various roles. Lindsay has been working in a more consulting kind of role for FEMA and other such agencies, right, in emergency management. All right, so with that, Chiara, why don't I hand over to you?
Sure. Thanks for having me in your class here today. I'll keep my introductions pretty brief because Professor Ganguly kind of got everything covered. So thank you. And I am a former student of Professor Ganguly. So if you ever have any interest in anything, always talk to him and something will happen. So I'm just going to share my screen briefly just to show the titles of the different. Actually, I can't do that, but I'll read out the titles out loud. So first, we're going to have.
One second, Chiara. I'll give you all co-host permissions. Sorry, I just forgot that. So you should be able to share your screen now. Just give me 1 second though before you do. Let me just give co-host permission to, where is Evan? Okay, so all the panelists and moderators should have co-host permission now. Yes, do you? Okay, all right. So Chiara, you should be able to share your screen now. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you. So first up, we're going to hear from Dr. Carling Hay, which, as Professor Ganguly said, is the lead climate scientist at risQ. And we're going to hear about climate change and sea level rise. And then we're going to shift to Professor Julia Hopkins, who's also here at Northeastern, and continue on the coastal route, but get a bit more into physics and the different infrastructure possibilities. And finally, we're going to end with Dr. Evan Kodra, who also a former Husky, who's gonna kind of take a different perspective on things and share how the US financial markets can potentially play a role in all of this. So those are their names and titles. And without further ado, if we're gonna have some question sections after each panelist, and then we're gonna have a final discussion at the end. So if you have questions for the presenters, feel free to put them in the chat or keep them, and then we'll open it up a little bit after their presentations. All right, and first up, Dr. Hay, if you'd like to.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Just Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me today. Excited to be part of this discussion. So I'm going to focus on the science of sea level rise and coastal flooding and really talk to you about why it's really important to understand what the underlying science is. So here we see this sort of dramatic photo of Boston. No, this never happened. I hope it never happens. But that may be sort of some sort of dramatization, but we see this sort of in the headlines all the time. We see coastal storms and hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy. We see the impacts of that up here in Cape Cod. We see sort of dramatic photos of waves coming on shore, things like king tides, taking over downtown Boston, people completely underwater, these sort of dramatic, scary photos of waves crashing on shore, entire communities, underwater all along the coast. And so when we see sort of all of these headlines in the news, we start to ask ourselves a few questions. The first one is whether or not all these flooding events are the same. Are they caused by the same types of things? The second is, we see all these headlines. And so why is it that the US East Coast seems to be at particular risk for coastal flooding? And then given that level of risk, how do we really expect or think that coastal flooding will change over time under the threat of climate change? So we're going to walk through these three questions and hopefully answer them in the next 15 minutes or so. So the first one is these events. So the most sort of iconic flooding type of event is from a hurricane, right? These sort of tropical cyclones, these really high winds push water on shore. They create these sort of dramatic photos like New York City during Sandy or Katrina in New Orleans. When that water comes on shore, it's particularly problematic if that happens at high tide, because you're adding sort of higher water levels on top of that storm surge. Something that's more critical up here in the Boston area and New England is the threat of nor'easters. These are wintertime storms One of the reasons why they're so dangerous is that one, they're a lot larger in size, and they also move a lot more slowly than hurricanes do. And the reason that's a problem is that the chance of them having that storm surge at the same time as high tide is a lot more likely than during a hurricane. And so you can get repeated storm surge over the course of 24 to 48 hours as those two events happen at the same time. I was not around for the blizzard of '78, but for anyone who was, that was sort of the iconic nor'easter for the Boston area. More recently, though, just a few years ago, was Nor'easter Grayson, just in 2018. And this image here is the aquarium stop downtown, just sort of completely inundated and flooded, really bad storm surge in the seaport and down by the aquarium. The third type of event that's really important, which is quite different than the other two, is what we call nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding. And this is flooding that happens not during any kind of storm, but just during a regular day when we have exceptionally high tides. That could be monthly high tides, that could be something called king tides, whatever it is, it's just an abnormally high water level that brings that water onshore. Now, when we look at all these three different types of events, it's important to remember that these things have always been happening, right? Hurricanes, nor'easters, high tides, those have been around, for as long as there's been weather and the ocean. But the reason why they're making the headlines so much more now and why the threat is so much more now is because of long-term sea level rise that's happening all along the US coasts. So that's something that we can actually monitor and look at and see how that sea level has changed over time. So we start up here in Boston. Boston has been recording sea levels since about the 1920s. Here we're looking at monthly average sea levels over time. You can see fluctuations month to month, year to year, as well as sort of decadal fluctuations in the record. And then what should stand out is this sort of long-term increase over time. And so in Boston, mean sea level has been increasing at a rate of about 2.8 millimeters per year. If we go down the coast to New Jersey, we can look at their record, which started in about 1910. We see that same sort of fluctuations year to year, but what you notice is that the rate of rise is quite different than the rate of rise in Boston. Here we have a rate of about 4 millimeters per year. Further down the coast in Annapolis, we see a long-term rate of about 3.7 millimeters per year. And finally, down here in Georgia, we get a rate of about 3.9 millimeters per year. So what you notice is that all the rates are different all along the coast. And the first thing that we want to understand is really why that's the case. And the reason we really care about why these rates are different is because if we want to make any projections for the future, we really need to understand that geographic variability in sea level to ensure that those projections are really localized to the region of interest and don't make any assumptions that sea level rise is uniform. So now we're getting into the sort of the science of this. We're talking about why sea level rise is different at different locations around the world. So there's three main components that we're going to walk through. I'm going to explain how they contribute to those rates that we saw on that previous slide. So the first component, which is ongoing sea level rise due to the last ice age, has absolutely nothing to do with climate change. Okay, so this is something that would be happening regardless of anything that we're doing today with rising temperatures. It has to do with the fact that about 20,000 years ago, we had these large ice sheets covering many areas of the Earth. That included a large ice sheet over northern North America, mostly Canada, a larger than present day ice sheet over Greenland, and then a large ice sheet covering parts of Northern Europe. So what happened is that when we had these large ice sheets sitting on land, they were so heavy that they actually suppressed the solid surface below it. So that material got pushed down beneath the ice. As that material got pushed down, it had to go somewhere. And so it actually formed bulges or former ice sheets. So the Earth gets pushed down beneath the ice and then forms this bulge. This is sort of like taking your bowling ball and putting it on your whatever favorite sort of memory foam mattress is, right? Put that bowling ball in the mattress depresses below it and then kind of bulges up around that bowling ball. So now when we melt that ice sheet, we get a rebound of that solid surface below the ice sheet, and then we get a subsidence or sinking of those bulges that formerly surrounded it. So similar to that bowling ball, we take it off the mattress, the part underneath bounces back up and those bulges sink back down. Now, of course, in our mattress world, that happens fairly instantaneously, right? Your mattress goes from being depressed to returning to its sort of flat pre-bowling ball state. The Earth, on the other hand, behaves quite differently from a mattress, which hopefully doesn't surprise you. And so that process happens on a much longer time scale than the mattress process. And so this effect is still going on today. The Earth is still responding to this process of unloading that happened about 10,000 years ago. Now, this is something that we can actually model and make predictions of. So here we're looking at, on the left, a model prediction of the present day rate of sea level change due to this ice age process. So areas in dark blue, these are areas that were formerly covered by ice sheets. So these are areas where that Earth is rebounding back up, and we're seeing a sea level fall in those areas. And then the areas in red are areas where those bulges were, those bulges that formerly surrounded the ice. Those are areas that are sinking back down. So over here on the left, we can see those bulges underwater where we had that uplift. And so after the ice age, those bulges sunk back down, and that's resulted in sort of a deepening of that water column above the bulges. And that results in that increase in sea level rise that we're seeing. So what you'll notice is that all along most parts of the US East Coast, we're in an area that was formerly a bulge. And so these are areas where we're experiencing this sea level rise due to this ice age process. In Boston in particular, we're seeing about 1 millimeter per year of sea level rise just due to this ice age process. So that's a third of the sea level rise that we're actually experiencing, which has absolutely nothing to do with climate change at all. Our second process that's really important for that geographic variability is warming of the oceans. So if you go back to your high school grade 9 science class, you might remember that when you heat water up, those water molecules start to move a lot faster, and start to spread up and take up more space. That results in sort of an expansion of your water column, or in our words, a deepening of that sea level. So that's happening all over the world. As we warm up our atmosphere, the ocean uptakes that heat, also releases heat in some areas, and it gives us a pattern like here on the right. So anywhere in blue is where the ocean is getting a little bit cooler, and so that column might be getting smaller, and anywhere in red is getting warmer. And so what you can see is that in many parts of the US East Coast and the Gulf Coast, we're seeing these pockets of bright red. So those are areas where we're getting a lot of heating of the water column, and we're getting sort of these hot spots of sea level rise as those temperatures warm. And the third component, which I think is the most interesting component and is really sort of formed the basis of a lot of my work when I was an academic, is melting of present day ice sheets. So this is melting of Greenland, of Alaska, the Alps, sort of any present day ice sitting on land. So the old idea, sort of this classic old physics idea, is if you had a large ice sheet sitting on land and you melt that ice sheet, that water would spread out uniformly over the oceans. So very similar to just pouring water into a bathtub. But what actually happens is something really counterintuitive. You have a large ice sheet sitting on land, like the Greenland ice sheet, and it's so massive that it actually exerts a gravitational attraction on the surrounding water. The result of that is that water piles up close to this ice sheet. When we then melt that ice sheet, say due to present day warming, you have a relaxation of that gravitational attraction. And so water actually migrates away from the melting ice. As water migrates away, you see an area of sea level fall close to the melting ice, and then an area of sea level rise further away. And so this iconic pattern of sea level rise close to the melting ice sheet, sea level fall close to the melting ice and sea level rise further away is what we call a sea level fingerprint. And the reason we call it a fingerprint is that that geometry is unique to every single melting ice sheet. So as an example of what that actually looks like, here we're looking at sort of the expected change in sea level if you were to melt enough ice off of the West Antarctic to raise the oceans uniformly by 1 meter of water. Okay, so if you assume the bathtub model and you melted enough ice to raise the oceans by 1 meter, this is the pattern that you would actually see. So anywhere in bright red is an area where you would expect to see that sort of bathtub amount of 1 meter of sea level rise. Everywhere in blue, that dark blue, these are areas where you're seeing dramatic sea level falls close to that melting ice sheet. You're going to see falls orders of magnitude larger than what you would expect from that rise. And then areas in red are places where you're going to see more sea level rise than you'd expect. So you're looking at 10, 20, 30% more sea level rise than that bathtub model predicts. And the reason the West Antarctic ice sheet in particular is so important for us here is that if you notice all along both the east and west coast of the US, we're sort of sitting in that dark red color. So we experience about 30% more sea level rise along the US East Coast than you would expect if you were to pour that water uniformly over the oceans. And so when we look at these sort of 3 different processes and all that sort of complicated geographic variability, that's what's going into those historical sea levels that we're seeing along the coast. Every area is experiencing something different due to these 3 processes. So now with that in mind, we can turn back to our sort of local sea level here in Boston. And remember that sort of in that historical rate of 2.8 millimeters per year, we're seeing all of those 3 things happen. We can take those processes and make a projection for the future. So we can say, how will that ice age effect change sea level in the future? How will that thermal expansion and warming affect it? And then more importantly, how will the melting of each individual ice sheet affect local sea level in Boston compared to local sea level, say, in Georgia? And so here we're looking at some projections through the century that do that exact thing. They take all the physics of those 3 different components of sea level rise, incorporate that geographic variability, all the uncertainty in those processes, and make these projections out to the end of the century. Our top frame here is an absolute change in sea level, whereas the bottom is a rate of sea level change. What you'll notice is that our 3 different types of projections, our blue is our best case scenario, red is our worst. They're fairly similar until about 2040, 2050, at which point they start to diverge. And the uncertainties in that worst case are also a lot worse than the uncertainties in our best case. That all has to do with sort of uncertainties in ice sheet melting over the next 40 or 50 years that really sort of causes that divergence and increases the uncertainty. And so now that we have our sort of fully probabilistic physical projections, what does that mean for our coastal cities? How do we take those events and figure out how properties and towns will be affected? So for that, we look at something called a flood map. And what we do is we take our present day topography, in this case for the Boston area as an example, and we determine which areas would lie underwater in a particular flood event. For a historical 100-year event, that height is about 9.8 feet. So we simply put any elevation that's below 9.8 feet underwater. You can see that that sort of puts areas around the aquarium underwater, as well as parts of South Boston. If we now take those projections of sea level rise and we get our new maps, we see something quite different. So here, this is looking at 36 inches of sea level rise. So sort of a worst case for 2070. So nothing you need to worry about in the next year or 2. What you can see is we're looking at 3 different types of floods. The darkest ones, that's our nuisance flooding, that sunny day flooding. You can see that parts of Faneuil Hall around the aquarium into the financial district, those are all now flooding and underwater at least sort of once a month. Our sort of lightest color here is our 100-year storm. You can see pretty much all of the seaport is underwater, many parts of East Boston, as well as areas of Charlestown. And under that scenario, about half of the buildings in downtown Boston are exposed during one of these events. So what do we do when we include all that physics and we get these projections? How do we sort of move forward in time and adapt? We can rebuild. This is what happens or happened in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. We can raise our buildings. If you drive south along sort of the south shore of the Cape, you'll see this all along the coastline. We can retreat and restore back to our natural habitat. And we can also build barriers, which is very common in parts of Europe and is obviously under consideration here. And so I'll leave you on that note and let Professor Hopkins, address this in a bit more detail. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Hay. Yes, Professor Hopkins, get that clapping going. So before we get into the next presentation, I figured we'd take some questions from students. If any students have any questions they want to bring up, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand in like the Zoom hand raising thing. You all know how to do that. Or I've got a couple questions for you, Dr. Hay, if no one has any questions yet, or Professor Ganguly, you always have questions, so if you have anything you want to hop in with.
Yeah, so one thing I have, Carling, I mean, of course, you know, so some of us know about this, this effect, what you just explained about, you know, the sea level rise the rise of sea level will be farthest from where the melting of ice is actually happening. Couple of things. Would you mind, I mean, this is obviously very counterintuitive. So do you mind please explaining for all of us the physics that you already went through, but just in a little bit more detail? And also, is there any relatively simple way for students to run some experiments to see that? So just as we can, you know, easily run experiments with ice in a glass of water, and see that, look, when the ice melts, here's what happens to that level of water kind of thing. Is there a way to, I mean, maybe not that simply in this case, but is there a way to do this in an experimental setup, whether in a lab or anywhere, and how do people know this kind of thing? How do people validate this as a hypothesis? So when people had the bathtub model and then they went to this, why did they go to this? What is the process? How do people validate these hypotheses? Just for everybody to understand.
Sure. So I guess I'd start with, I can't think of any simple way that you would test this in a lab. I mean, it's similar, you know, not the same thing, but similar to tides, right? So you can go out and watch sort of the gravitational effect of the sun and the moon on the oceans, right? So it's a similar scale to that, although obviously not as, doesn't change as frequently because that ice is just sort of sitting there. And so it becomes sort of a new state of the ocean. So I can't think of any way where you could actually test it in the lab. Certainly this is something we do with numerical models, right? You can write, you know, in 100 lines of code, you can write your own experiment of, you know, of the sort of the full physics of the equations to see sort of that output. I mean, it is something that is tested and observed in observations. So there's many people who go out and put sensors at the bottom of the ocean and detect that sea level change close to the ice sheet. So that's sort of like that's, you know, one way. But it really is incredibly counterintuitive and incredibly sort of, you know, when I first learned about it, I was like, I don't understand it. And then I, you know, thought about the physics and it made sense, but it sort of is just incredibly counterintuitive. It's important to note also that, you know, it's large gravitational attraction on the water, but it's not, you know, instantaneous like the tides in the sense that it's, you know, flowing back and forth. So as that water, you know, piles up close to your ice sheet, it also presses down the seafloor beneath it. So if you were to sort of, you know, take a boat up to an ice sheet, you're not going to start going up on the slant of water, right? That water has already pushed down the earth below it. So at the surface, you feel like you're on sort of an even level. But that depth of water is going to be deeper than if that large ice sheet weren't there. And so it's really sort of that same idea as the tides, you know, you decrease this gravitational attraction just by melting the ice. And suddenly this water just doesn't want to be there anymore. You know, it wants to find some new sort of resting place. And so it just moves away. And this effect, I mean, it is instantaneous. So as soon as you melt that, you see that happening, and you can go in, you know, you can go into northern parts and see this. You can go to Alaska and you can watch sea levels fall. I mean, it's been there for a very long time, but they're observed to be falling because of this process. So not in the lab, I'd say, but if your lab, you know, is in the right places and outdoors, then you could definitely test it.
Thank you so much, Carla. Kara?
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting, and I learned a lot about this that I didn't know that I didn't know. So I appreciate it. If no one has any questions from students, Gabrielle, if you wanted to ask a
Yeah.
question.
Just a quick clarification. So you said that like by the ice sheets, the water isn't like at a slope when it's like the higher sea level because of gravity. So then like after the ice sheets are melted and then there's sea level rise like on the East Coast or wherever, would it also like be flat and just be like pushing down the sea floor at that area, or is it actually like slanted? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I understand that. That's a great question. So anything, if you leave it long enough, will come to sort of this new equilibrium. So if you were to melt, enough water to really bring enough water or ice off of, say, Iceland or Greenland or the Antarctic to significantly change sea levels, over time that the earth below the Boston shores would slowly depress and sink down with that sort of extra weight of the water above it. When you're talking about smaller amounts, right, you have it washing on shore. It's not just, it's not just sitting there because you have ocean currents and waves and tides and all those things that are going on. But yes, over time, if you completely melted the Greenland ice sheet and you raise the oceans by meters, that is a very heavy column of water sitting along the U.S. East Coast, and that will depress the surface below.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Thank you. And I'll take, well, it looks like Bharat also has a question. Maybe we'll take Louisa and then Bharat, and then we'll get into Professor Hopkins' presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, I just had a quick question if there was like any type of cutoff for how like massive a sheet of ice needs to be considered to have like a significant effect on this.
That's a great question. I don't know if I have an exact number for you, but this is physics. Every item exerts some sort of gravitational attraction, on every other item, right? I mean, we ourselves have some sort of gravitational pull, or just it's small compared to everything else going on. So I'm not sure if I don't know off the top of my head, but every single glacier you can think of is large enough to have this effect. Okay. Whether it's a glacier in Africa or the glaciers in the Alps, they're all sort of enough mass of water sitting on land that you'll see this with melting of those ice sheets.
Thank you.
Hi. So my question is regarding the first point regarding the subsidence and the pushback after the ice has been melted. In context of the coastal region, so this effect is very localized, right? So right now there was an ice, had some subsidence in this region, but the water level is more or less controlled by the Earth's gravitational pull, right? So after this is removed, how would the rise in the sea level would be impacted only because of this first factor regarding the subsidence?
From the last ice age, subsidence. Mm-hmm. So that's ongoing. So it's sort of a decaying process. So eventually that subsidence will stop and it will reach a new equilibrium, just due to that deformation from the last ice age. But today, here it's that subsidence is happening at a rate of about 1 millimeter per year. Other parts further along the U.S. East Coast, in sort of New Jersey, that area, it's happening at a lot faster of a rate. So, and that will slowly decrease over time. But it's a large enough process that it's incredibly visible. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
So, I mean, after the ice is removed, the coastal regions go up, right?
Some do, depending on where you are.
So basically, that is your city is basically rising above the water. So
your city is rising up. Parts of it, yes, on land also, but also depending on where, if you're at somewhere on right at the coast, if there's water there, it's sinking back down. So it depends on where the ice was. So there wasn't ice necessarily over Boston during the last ice age. So Boston itself was part of this bulge, and so it's sinking back down.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Right, so the ice didn't cover, all areas that are currently land, right? The ice margin was, just sort of south of the Canadian border. And so the bulge, parts of the bulge were over water, but parts of the bulge like cut across the United States. And so those areas are sinking back down. There's just no water on top of them to cause a sea level change. But anywhere where there is water, like along the US East Coast here, the areas that are underwater and we're part of the bulge are seeing that sea level rise.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hay, appreciate it. And next we'll go to Professor Hopkins, or he'll hear a little bit more about some coasts and see your cat. So whenever you want to present.
Awesome. All right, I'll share my screen. And yes, I have a little kitten who's fascinated by the light on the ceiling. So if he's running around and being a bit of a nuisance, that is why. I apologize in advance. He's been placated with some food. We'll see how well that works. All right. So let's dive a little bit more into, can you all see my slides? Let's see if I can actually make this go. Can you see the large slides and not the small thing on my extra screen?
Yep,
awesome.
just the slide.
Perfect, excellent. So that was a really good primer on sea level rise and climate change and why we should start caring about how exactly we're going to manage the coastal region over coming decades and what our options are. So I'm going to give a very brief presentation, given the subject material, about nature-based coastal infrastructure, why we might choose it and what it might look like in the coming few decades, as my little cat behind me wants to get in. Apologize for that. This slide has a myriad of images, and we're going to see each one of them in turn and how they relate, in particular to coastal-based infrastructure. So we're going to begin with the challenges. We've already been over kind of the big one, which is sea level rise. And I again show yet another diagram of sea level rise, just a bit of a sort of condensed one to the lower left-hand here, where you see, as Carling pointed out, as Dr. Hay pointed out, sea level rise is not going to be even over the globe, but what we know for sure is that the water levels around many coastal regions are going to change, and in some cases, change drastically. And this is coming in coincident with a generally warming ocean, which means that likely we're going to see more frequent and more intense tropical cyclones like hurricanes and typhoons. In the Atlantic Ocean in particular, because the ocean is going to be warming towards the northern latitudes, what we actually might start to see are hurricanes forming far north enough that instead of preferentially heading towards the east coast of the United States, they actually take a turn and head straight towards Europe, causing a lot more flooding in the North Sea and that region. All of this, of course, is happening at the same time as direct human causes and indirect human causes are pushing a loss of natural coastal habitats that would otherwise help to provide some resilience for coastal areas and possibly coastal communities. Two examples of this are on the right-hand side of the slide, where on the top, we have an image that shows mangrove losses in the world just over the past 15 years or so. This isn't quite updated. What you get is a sense of how much mangrove forest is being lost, either owing to quote unquote natural causes in purple or more direct human intervention in orange. And then there's the behemoth of the example in the bottom right-hand corner, which shows marsh loss in Louisiana. And this is definitely not an updated slide. This only goes up until 2000 and tries to predict the marsh loss further out. Louisiana has lost a ton of the natural defenses that would otherwise be vegetated foreshore before cities like New Orleans that could have otherwise protected New Orleans from a lot of flooding. And part of the reason this marsh degradation is happening is because we, the global we, the community of the United States, maintains a shipping channel that runs from the Mississippi River past New Orleans and straight out into the Gulf of Mexico. This shipping channel allows for a lot of trade, But at the same time, it takes all of the sediment and silt coming from the Mississippi River Basin, which is massive and full of farmland, and shoots it straight out into the Gulf of Mexico, which means that that sediment can't then be recirculated back to the marshland, naturally rebuilding it. So nature has a mechanism to keep these marshes alive, but there's some human intervention that is preventing it from acting on that mechanism. That's a quick idea of some of the broader challenges. A few more pressing examples are shown in these images. Here on the bottom left, we have the classic New York City post-Sandy image where you see the power outage in half of Lower Manhattan. I have images from my parents who live in Lower Manhattan of just streets turning into rivers. Brooklyn was hit hard, Queens was hit hard, millions of people were hit hard. This is a very dense city and it's exceedingly vulnerable, and yet this was 2012. Since 2012, I couldn't tell you that this shoreline looks appreciably any different. It is about as vulnerable to a coastal storm of the magnitude of Sandy as it was about 9 years ago. Other more international examples include what we see in the top right corner here, which is Indonesia. It's Jakarta. It's an interesting example because it's a combination of land subsidence owing to groundwater being pumped out to be used, is actually being used, but the groundwater being pumped out causes the land to subside. So the land is subsiding and sinking while the sea level is rising around it. And of course, this is all happening in a region that does get some storm activity. So that's definitely an immediate problem that needs to be addressed by effectively all of the coastal engineers in the world. And then a haven for some coastal engineers would be the Netherlands, which is the final image in the bottom right here. The Netherlands is no stranger to flooding. They are effectively at or below sea level as a country, and thus the Dutch have put a lot of resources into trying to figure out how to keep the sea at bay. I find this image particularly compelling because as you move from left to right, the blue shows the amount of flooding that the country would experience if certain flood defenses that are in place right now failed. So at the moment, the Dutch protect about half of their landmass and most of their population using a combination of dikes and dams and large barriers. And this is sort of an interesting image of what might happen if any of these barriers were to fail. And there's one more urgent example. What's this? This is actually a few images taken in 2018 from Boston. It's similar to some of the images that Dr. Hay showed. This is nor'easters hitting Boston. Boston is also not immune to this kind of flooding, and we're in a position where the flooding could just get appreciably worse. So that's roughly an idea of the problem. What can we do about it? We have the traditional approach. We have the traditional approach, which is called effectively hard structures. And these are structures that have been used time and time again. If you read the Army Corps of Engineers handbook, you're going to come up with something like this. They are levees, they are barriers, they are dikes, they are jetties. They are concrete or steel structures that are put into place to keep the water at bay. They're a very sort of intuitive idea when it comes to, we need to get the water out of here. What do we do? Put a barrier in. Awesome, we're done. There are a few problems with these structures, and they're becoming more and more apparent as climate change ramps up. For one, they're static. Once you put them in, that's it. And that removes a lot of natural variability. The structures themselves could be negatively impacting the surrounding natural environment and the surrounding natural coastal resilience defenses. Oftentimes, we don't necessarily study them enough to understand these complex and intricate side effects, but we know that they might be there. In the event climate change doesn't do what we think it does, and the answer is it probably is not going to do what we think it does, these kinds of structures are difficult and very costly to adjust to changing conditions. They don't have a whole lot of margin of error. You can add a few safety factors, but at some point you run out of numbers to multiply. They tend to be monodisciplinary. A lot of these are sort of traditional civil engineering structures. If you take, for instance, a fluid mechanics class with me, I will teach you how to design a dam. If you take a class in the Netherlands, they will teach you how to design a weir. And these are sort of known formulas. Civil engineers do it. Give us some design parameters, we'll put that design into place, call it a day. And finally, as I said before, these things work until they don't. And the until they don't is sort of what we are really focused on as an engineering community. So they're working right now so far. The Netherlands is mostly dry, but what do we do next? What are some options to either fortify these hard structures or to take a completely different tack when it comes to coastal engineering? Well, another option are quote unquote soft structures. These are more natural solutions. So for instance, you have the image in the lower right here, the room for the river. This is an image taken from Rijkswaterstaat, which is a Dutch water board effectively. And their idea is that rivers are going to flood. We know this. So why not artificially push some dikes back and give the river the space that it needs to flood so that we don't risk flooding places where people are currently living. Living with water, that is definitely an excellent solution. Another is marsh restoration. We know that marshes and mangroves and things along these lines will help to protect coastal environments. Let's actually just put it back and see what happens. There are some complications here, of course, which is that to restore a fully natural environment, you need to have, one, a lot of time, things take time to grow, and two, have a good idea of where to begin and sort of where to put your efforts so you have the most efficient restoration possible. This is all ongoing work and it's really fascinating. Soft solutions could be really good. They tend to be dynamic, they are natural, they tend to work with nature as a result. They also might, and I say might because we can't prove this, but they've got a better shot of adjusting to various climate change scenarios. And they're multidisciplinary. They involve a lot of things, including ecologists, geologists, oftentimes policymakers, especially if you want to put it near where people are living, and many, many more. Today, however, I want to focus on one of the combinations of these more hard and soft structures to something that's a little bit of a hybrid, a little bit more engineered than a straight marsh, but less hard concrete steel than a straight barrier. And that is what we call the emerald tutu. It's an example of a new field sparking in the coastal area, which is called nature-inspired or nature-based infrastructure, something that takes some of the advantages of soft structures, but combines it with something that we actually might be able to put in place in a relatively short amount of time. So the image you see right smack here is an aerial photograph of East Boston, and around it you see all these tiny little green dots. And this is a schematic, a sketch of what the emerald tutu might look like if you arrange it around an urbanized coastal environment. The emerald tutu is a series of interlinked, densely vegetated mats, and it uses both the vegetation and the fact that they are networked together to help dampen out waves and storm surge. And as a result, as you can see, it transforms the coastline of an urbanized environment. It's not meant for beaches, not necessarily. It's been designed for something that has a little bit more hard structure and would like to be ameliorated with a certain amount of soft structure. The emerald tutu also considers stakeholder engagement. This is something that is sometimes a difficult sell for a lot of, for instance, hard structures or other coastal engineering solutions. What is going to be the benefit of the local community before a storm comes, before you have a flooding event? The emerald tutu is trying to engage with this, and the coastal environmental community is trying to engage with this at large by starting to work more with policymakers, work more with local communities to see how we can make it benefit local communities, even without an impending storm or impending surge. And you can just sort of see a few whimsical examples of what people might do when they interact and have a different relationship with the coastline. So we have an idea, we have a design, we have lots of schematics. How do we figure out how this thing is going to work, and how do we figure out how we can design these networks? Well, we need to understand a bunch of things. Ideally, we would have a mat, several mats as products, and then also a model that can help us to design the shape of the network and the number of mats that we might need for a given coastal region. And to make this model work, we're going to need to have a regional scale model. I show a few schematics right here that have some inputs and give us some useful outputs. For instance, let's start on the left-hand side. Delft3D, large regional scale model. If we give it boundary waves, currents, a map of the seafloor, and an idea of what the tutu actually looks like and the dynamics inside of the tutu, it should be able to give us in return waves, currents, and water levels, and subsequently flooding. And then we can use that to better design a tutu around a given natural or urban environment. Right in the middle, you have sort of a schematic of this grid, where we have a larger grid, which is the large grid, smaller grid, which is a smaller grid, and an idea of how currently the tutu is being represented in this type of regional model. This is sort of the default for any regional model: vegetation equals rods. Kind of what we got to work with now. And then finally, on the furthest right, you just see a visual example of what these grids look like. And these are grids that are specific to the Boston Harbor for the 300-meter grid and then right around the Boston Islands for the 30-meter grid. So in order to get this kind of regional model to work, which is kind of what we're going for in the end, we want this to be faithful and we want it to be accurate, we're going to need a few things. We're going to need to understand vegetation dynamics. That's a big one. We're going to understand how the vegetation on the mats themselves interact with the surrounding flow, how the network of this vegetation then causes waves and surge to dampen. We're going to need to understand storm dynamics. Luckily, we're not the only people working on this one. A lot of people are looking to understand how storms are going to change as we move forward in the coming decades. And then finally, we're going to need to understand infrastructure dynamics, the connection between the tutu itself and the land behind it, and all of the buildings and all of the people and everything that might be impacted by a given surge or a given storm. So we're going to start to do this in a couple of different ways. The first thing we're going to focus on are the vegetation dynamics. And we begin by looking at an idealized model or a hypothesis of what we are trying to study. This is a network model scale that is broken down into a few parts. It's basically a long pool of water where on the left-hand side, we have a wave generator. We can generate all sorts of waves, different wave heights, periods, directions, etc. In the middle, we have the tutu structure, which is represented in some sort of intelligent way. And at the end, we have a damping structure or a beach. And we can use this to run a bunch of waves to see how the tutu structure responds and how then the waves respond to the tutu structure. And we're going to be verifying this particular network model this summer using the tsunami flume in the Oregon State University NERI facility, where we're building a scaled network of the emerald tutu that we're going to then put into the flume, which you can see on the left-hand side here, and run as many wave conditions as we possibly can, random waves, natural waves, more idealized waves, to get a sense of both how individual mats respond and how the network itself is going to respond to all of these types of conditions. And then once we have that, we turn to the next thing. We turn to the storm dynamics. We turn to putting these kinds of dynamics into these models so that we can faithfully use the models to better design coastal defense structures. And more broadly speaking, the field in general is trying to continuously, as you can see in all of these images to the right-hand side, study the natural world to gain the inspiration that we need to figure out the natural solutions which might be best suited for the different varieties of coastal environments and coastal communities that exist around the world. And then, of course, we have to think hard about the big question, which is, given what we know, given what we think we can figure out, given what we're designing, under what circumstances must we start to consider coastal retreat? And how? How do we best implement this? So thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Professor Hopkins. That was really interesting and great to transition from Dr. Hay to learn more about it. Okay. Do we have any questions from students or TAs or professors?
While everybody is thinking about a question, I have one burning question. Julia, how far are we from, well, just for everybody else, many of you are already aware, some of you may not be, that, civil engineers, when we design something, we operate in a very relatively strict and standard way. So we have our codes. American Society of Civil Engineers have their codes and standards and specifications. So Julia, my question is, how far away do you think we are from that for these kind of, the soft infrastructures? How far away are the Dutch? I mean, they are the world leaders in this. So how far away are they? Do they already have some of these sort of codified in some sense? What needs to happen in the US? How far away are we?
Yeah, so the Dutch are close in some senses and haven't quite started exploring in others. So let me see if I can find, I actually have, if I stop not the share, but stop the presentation. Oh, that's geoengineering, ignore that. Okay, so the Dutch actually are really good when it comes to what you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, which is sandy nourishments. The Dutch coastline is fairly uniform-ish, especially compared to like many of the coastlines in the world. They have this interesting notion that they can take all of their hard barriers and they can fortify them using nourishments and sand in front of the hard barriers, and then at the very least buy some time to figure out something else. So this massive sandy structure at the bottom right-hand corner here is known as the zandmotor, or the sand engine. And it is meant to be a mega nourishment, a long-term nourishment that you put out once, and then theoretically it will protect the hinterland for the next, I think they were aiming for 20 years for this one. And this is just a pilot project. The Dutch are being very good about putting money into pilot projects that they can then study to see how well they work and how they might start to change or implement them. The Dutch are also very active internationally. I believe New Orleans contracted a Dutch company when it was trying to rebuild its levees. The Dutch have been helping to study the implications of Hurricane Sandy on Fire Island. And they're sort of existing in the ether of the consulting sphere and spreading these ideas throughout the world. The United States has an interesting sort of approach to this kind of thing where it's very localized. I think Dr. Hayes spoke about this a little bit. It's very localized in terms of the types of actions that are likely to be taken by any sort of coastal area. So it's sort of becoming more and more a question of how do you engage people in this conversation so that it becomes a more natural thing to want to try and adopt. And especially since nature-based solutions should ideally have a lot of co-benefits where, you know, it could be equivalent, you could almost have it equivalent to creating a new park or something along those lines that just also happens to be storm infrastructure. We're trying to make it easier to adapt without sort of a lot of the rigorous engineering codes that currently exist, for instance, for the Army Corps. But that's another reason why we need to have the science down, because we need to make sure, to the best of our ability, that these things actually work, so we can convince people that they're worth investing in. That might be a transition. We'll see.
Thank you. We can take a couple questions and then transition, and then we'll also have some time after Dr. Kodra's presentation for more questions too. So Isabella, I think I saw your hand up first, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I just had a quick question, like what kind of plants do you think would be like in the mats?
That is an excellent question. So at the moment, we're thinking for the Boston area in particular, we've got a combination of local seagrass and kelp, and we think that those would seed the mats fairly quickly, given that they're somewhat endemic to the region. Any sort of biofouling, honestly, we welcome, because that just adds the density of the mats and that sort of makes them operate all the much better. But the general idea is that we're going to try and focus on local vegetation that we think would seed relatively quickly and be relatively hardy. So something that can't survive winter very well probably isn't something we want to be pulling up to the Northeast. And similarly, we want to be mindful of the types of chemical compositions that may be around an estuary, for instance, versus more of an urbanized, slightly more polluted environment, and adopt the plant life to sort of be matching each of those. And so at the moment we're focused in Boston, we've thought a lot about the kinds of vegetation we want to start here as pilot projects. But the idea is that when we take this to other parts of the country to start with, and then hopefully more areas in the world after, we will be studying first the immediate environment and then using that as our template.
Thank you. Jessamine, I believe you were next. And then after that, we'll let Jack ask the question and then we'll transition.
Hi, I was hoping that you could explain more how these like floating islands of plants help prevent flooding. Like it seems like you were saying that they like add some friction, which kind of like holds back waves. And if that's true, I was wondering why like plants are particularly good at this. Like would they like, do they do a better job than like a solid column of something just sitting in the water?
They don't do a better job necessarily, but they're definitely better for the job that they do. So I'm going to sort of settle on this image right here, just to look at the tutu network that's over on the bottom right-hand side. So the idea is that the vegetated mats, this is schematic. This is not nearly as big as they would otherwise be. The vegetated mats are very dense. They have vegetation both growing out from the top and from the bottom. And that last bit is actually rather critical. So not only are you getting the idea that they are just large things that are interlinked together, so they pull on each other as water comes through, and that dissipates energy from the water as it's moving through this mat structure, but also they generate some extra turbulence and friction from both the top and the bottom. And we know from lab experiments, at least from lab experiments that just involve spherical structures floating and just involve emergent vegetation above, that this can have an effect at reducing energy in the water column, which would then theoretically reduce waves and potentially even surge. The thing that we don't know that we are super excited to start studying this summer is what happens when you have submerged vegetation at the bottom that is not linked to the bed. We know that's a great idea, like that's basically a marsh, like that'd be great, but is instead linked to a floating object. How does that interact with the water column? And what kind of, for instance, friction factor could we assign to it if that is how we wanted to start treating these in our model? Yeah, so it's definitely, it's an ongoing piece of research. So initial, very sort of schematized, for instance, CFD models suggest that this is definitely worth pursuing. And that's why we're turning to an actual physical model to see if we can make it work.
Thank you. I'm sure that'll be very fun playing with the tsunami flume.
Be good.
All right, Jack, I accidentally unraised your hand, but if you wanted to ask your question, and then we'll go on.
So I was curious about, given that this kind of thing is designed for, in part, urban environments and presumably degraded aquatic environments along, things like the Boston Harbor. How much thought has been put into the aquatic ecological impacts of something like this, either positive or negative?
That is an excellent question. So the short answer is a lot of thought, but not a lot of research just yet. For most regulatory bodies along the coastline, there needs to be some indication of how, for instance, structure like this is going to interact with the local flora and fauna. That's part of the reason we initially designed it for places that are going to effectively be slightly more polluted, have less biodiversity, and be ecologically less sound in general, because we want to add this in a place where it's going to be a net positive. None of the materials that we're using right now are plastic or steel or concrete or anything along those lines. The idea is that if a mat breaks off of the network and floats away, it'll be fine. That's sort of what we're going for. When it comes to putting this in, for instance, an already well-established estuary or well-established marsh, we would try not to do that because those already are coastal resilient structures in and of themselves. And what's probably best for those areas is to have some sort of assistance rather than an entirely new structure. But if we had to, or for instance, this seemed like it would be the assistance of seeding the local marsh with a bit more of the natural vegetation in this particular way would be the most benefit, then we might consider it. Additionally, this could be something that might work well with, oyster farms or places where there's a benthic environment that is fairly robust, but the water column in the environment above is not so much. One thing that someone brought up recently that which could be an interesting consequence is how this interacts with birds. That was someone just asked what the birds do, and I was like, I actually don't know. We're gonna need to put one out in the water and see. So yeah, a lot of factors to consider.
Thanks, Professor Hopkins. Then we think about birds and like windmills and those impacts.
Lots of stuff, yeah.
Totally different area, but all right. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Evan Kodra, if you want to pop on in. And thank you, Professor.
Can everybody hear me? Mine's freezing on my end, so okay, cool.
You want us to share your slides? If you
No, it's okay. I can do it. I think it had a I don't know. Whatever. I've been having an unstable internet in general, so if I drop off, it's not because I don't like you all. Let me find my screen share thing. Oh, it says only one. Am I allowed to screen share?
Yes.
You should be able to.
But if for some reason it's not working because of the internet connection, you can send it to Kara or I.
Just click the button, not the arrow.
Oh, wow. Amazing. I am getting older. All right, here we go. Yeah, okay. So thank you, everybody. So I don't know if you had this in mind, Auroop, but I think this flows really nicely from the first two presentations. So anyway, thanks for asking me to talk about stuff. I'm going to do a little bit of a different thing than I've done than I have done historically. This, you could think of one way to think about this is like, as at least for the U.S., how would something like this conceivably get like incentivized and deployed and funded and all those kinds of things. So that's one way to think about some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. I'll give you a little bit of background on risQ. We started in 2016 off of National Science Foundation funding, co-founded by myself, Auroop, and another co-founder, Colin Sullivan, still there. We started working, we originally started with the premise of taking, some kind of global climate model outputs and using them to inform how the insurance industry prices its catastrophe risk. So risk related to things like hurricanes, floods, wildfires, or I guess other things that the insurance industry cares about that fall in that same class that are not climate related, like earthquakes and terrorism and pandemics and all those kinds of things. But for our sake, we knew that, okay, so if the risk of flooding and fires and heat stress and all these things and hurricanes are changing, isn't the insurance industry taking that into account? And it turns out that back then, the answer was no. And so the initial premise of the company was to take a lot of this good research that's been happening for a long time in academia that at the time really hadn't been translated to anything, at least in the financial services market or really in the private sector at all, and try to see if we could sort of bridge that gap and do something and put it into, help put this type of stuff into practice. So we spent a bunch of time. I'll go ahead and skip to the third slide if you don't mind, please. Oh wait, that's right. I'm still sharing it. I was thinking that we had to pass over to you. Okay, so the idea of what happened here roots back to this article that I should have probably put in the slide. But back in the early '90s, there was no idea of this industry called catastrophe modeling. Catastrophe modeling was started actually in Boston by a woman named Karen Clark. We started a company called AIR Worldwide back in the early '90s. And the very basic premise of it at the time was nobody actually has any good idea how much you could lose if a major hurricane were to, say, hit Miami. Nobody actually knows how many billions of dollars you could lose. So this was before all of the models for that type of thing existed. And the insurance, the insurance industry at the time, not being particularly forward thinking or good at thinking about tail probabilities or anything that's sort of beyond what happens on average, like average car accident rates or something like that. When Hurricane Andrew hit, a bunch of primary insurance companies went bankrupt because they just didn't have enough capital and reserves to actually pay out all their claims. So after that point, her idea took off and turned into AIR Worldwide, which is his, I believe, headquarters. I think the headquarters are in Boston. They're a global company now, and it's a pretty mature industry by this point. So it's basically this idea of catastrophe modeling companies that go out and build all these pretty interesting physical, stochastic, you name it, different techniques for estimating losses, things like property losses that would correlate to insurance claims, and then helping the different members of the risk transfer industry figure out how much they could lose in a risk, a rare event or an unprecedented event, and do things like structure their premiums accordingly, or manage their exposure accordingly. And so what happened was, in fact, what they really used that to do was to manage their exposure. And so the insurance gap is really almost a polite way of saying that the insurance industry really hasn't actually done what it should do to shift the burden, to actually pick up the burden of climate losses and risk. And because they've gotten good at modeling this stuff, at least good enough, they've managed to manage their, or not only modeling, but sort of lobbying and all these kinds of other things, and designing their payouts, structuring the way that they pay things out in ways that are clever, and all those kinds of things, have managed to push what is now the majority of the burden of climate risk onto the spectrum of the public. And that's getting worse, and as you can imagine, amplifying with climate change as well. So a few different pieces here that we could look through. So you could think of it at all levels. You could think of it at the federal level. So this article, this stuff doesn't take long to find, right? Like I found all these just as this is a brand new article as of a couple of days ago. People are talking about this all the time now. But one quote from this article on Bloomberg is, so for those of you who were kind of following the Texas winter storm, among other horrible humanitarian things, there are estimating between something like 15 and 20 billion dollars in losses, which is actually about as bad as the wildfires, the crazy wildfire season of last year already was. And a lot of this, so 80%, I think we're estimating at least of at least flood insurance in the U.S. for residential homeowners, at least, is just completely uninsured. And then FEMA ends up picking the tab up for those that are insured in residential locations, but owing to long-term, poorly structured incentives, which the NFIP program was originally actually an incentive program for people to develop, to stimulate the economy and develop houses in risky floodplains, and it's sorely antiquated by now. All that is to say that the NFIP is deeply in debt, and back in, I think it was post Harvey in the 2017 year, the Congress had to actually just waive billions of dollars worth of their debt so that they could be solvent. And so this problem isn't going anyway anytime soon. And then at the municipal, so that's the federal level. The municipal level, for example, this is where risQ really started. This is where we ended up moving over towards, and I'll talk more about that soon. But this municipal level, one quick example is the Paradise, the campfire that burned down most of the city of Paradise in 2018. Definitely instigated a lot of, thinking back to that story that I was talking about with respect to Hurricane Andrew. That was sort of a smaller moment, but a similar analog to what happened in the insurance industry in the 90s, where the municipal sector realized that they actually needed to care about this. Not too long before that, they weren't worried about it because, in quotes, cities don't default. So then, of course, the most important case really is the individual, family, community burden. So if those, this is a snapshot of, it's hard to see here, but might be hard to see here if you have a small screen, but it's basically, it's a comparison of who's uninsured or who is actually technically going to be insured according to the FEMA floodplain versus, where the flood damage actually was. Multiply that by the fact that most people in SFH, what we would call FEMA SFHA, which is this floodplain designated area, only about 20% of them even have the insurance that they're supposed to have. And so all that is to say, the vast majority of homeowners don't have that insurance. And so they're stuck holding the bag unless, they're prioritized by FEMA in some kind of emergency or disaster declaration where FEMA will spend its dollars to help people out to some extent. And that's riddled with problems as well. And of course, as you would imagine, this falls the most heavily on the people that, the populations of the United States that have historically and continue to be marginalized. There are people that know a lot more about the details of this than I do in terms of, the policy decisions that went into these types of things, the socioeconomic statistics that are an outfall. But there are things historically. So for example, here this is just published like 2 days ago. as you know, as some of America is finally starting to apparently, you know, reckon with some of the structural racism that we have, you know, been dealing with forever. This article just came out by Redfin, which uses a couple of different interesting data sets. This is a picture from a related, I believe it's University of Virginia Richmond institution that put together these historical red line maps, which are basically places that have disproportionately high climate risk, but are also have been marginalized in the sense of, so if you look at these red areas, the basic idea of this is that in those days there were disproportionately people of color living in these places and were considered too risky to insure if they took out a mortgage, right? And so that adds up over time, of course, create the wealth gap, but also these places have been neglected in terms of, you know, all the other things that you would suspect. So they tend to be urban heat islands. They tend to flood more easily, and so on and so forth. So this is also, you know, so climate risk can't really be separated from social inequality in the US, and that's true globally, but I'll just stick to the US for now. So that's I also want to emphasize that's not only a function of, you know, past decisions, it's a function of present decisions. There's a lot of information in this graph, but the basic gist of it is that homeowners that are, you know, the locations with poorer and more Black and brown homeowners pay disproportionately higher property taxes than their affluent peers. And so basically that is to say, they're paying way more than their fair share of the property taxes that make cities run. So property taxes are the backbone of the revenues of cities. And so this is still going on today in basically every American city. If you think of what public finance really is, it's, you know, it has a responsibility. If you take it like at face value, it has a responsibility being public finance to finance things that are in the interest of the public. On top of that, what we're starting to see is an upstream push for more investment in social impact, and I'll get to that in a bit. But as well as the fact that, you know, as far as climate risk and as far as socioeconomic inequality goes, at writ large, this market, though it's, you know, should feel that they have the financial incentive to take care of these problems to the best of their ability. We know that, you know, it's well known that, you know, growing inequality is an economic destabilizer a long time. And of course, that's going to be amplified by and correlated to climate risk and climate damage. So this system, you know, beyond having a responsibility, there's like a mechanic for doing something about climate change here. So this is a bit of a mouthful, I guess, this slide, and I put it together. I just put this together last night. Probably could be better, but so the idea here is this is a little bit of a detour to how the U.S. public debt market works. You've got retirement funds, pension funds, what you would call retail investors, so high net worth individuals that are worth $10 million or more, or SMAs. So these are separately managed accounts. So essentially means billionaires that just get their own white glove service at any institutional money manager. This whole market is worth about $4 trillion in terms of active capital. So there's a lot of money in U.S. public finance. Most people don't know too much about it. What's going on in blue is sort of the catalysts of change that I could see either happening now or you know, should or I expect will happen. So right now, some of these folks, a decent number of these folks, upstream of the actual people that buy municipal bonds, are starting to demand change to some extent, at least, right? They still want to make money, but they want to see their money do good. So we could think of this as impact investment. There's a industry term now, it's called environmental social governance. It's supposed to be you know, if you put your money in an ESG 401k, you theoretically should be feeling better about not doing environmental damage by by saving for retirement. And especially the high leverage individuals have been for the last few years asking about climate And in the wake of things like George Floyd's murder, asking now for investments somehow into, into making structural, racism and inequality better, basically. So these are sort of the clients of the clients of what I would say are our clients. Asset managers would sit in all of your major institutional banks. They invest in municipal debt. So what that really means in practice is they are like the credit card of a city. So a city like Boston will do the big dig. If for any of you who are familiar with that, basically a big digging up the city and putting a tunnel under it and doing all kinds of stuff, cost billions of dollars. They funded that by putting out basically a municipal bond and raising the money from institutional banks, and in return they use the revenues or property taxes coming from their jurisdiction to pay that bond back over time with a fixed interest rate that's tax exempt. And so, meaning if they funded the big dig, that means they also have that means this whole system, right, has the equipment and the mechanics theoretically for funding something like what Julie is working on. Investors then, where we're at right now is as a company, the investors are taking all this data that we produce about climate risk that is related to property taxes. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that for this particular talk, but the basic gist is taking what the catastrophe modeling community did for insurance and repurposing the idea for this sector and focusing it more on the risks that investors in municipal bonds and similar instruments care about. So what is whether a particular issuer of debt, like a more rural, say Louisiana coastal town, whether their debt is impaired in terms of just the economic situation there, aside from the climate situation. So they use these, they're starting to think about this as a risk problem in the same way that in a way that they probably should have for a long time, but because public finance has been treated almost as a risk-free thing, there aren't too many tools, or there haven't been too many tools until the last couple of years for them to think about what is, where is the risk that I'm putting my investment or my client's retirement money in. / some of my clients also are increasingly caring about doing good. So the idea is that the investors, the actual institutional investors, will start to price in this risk. Whether that's, whether that happens really, really formulaically is another question, but you'll hope to see, or expect, I guess, to see with a lot of asterisks, the market sort of tilt towards demanding more return for investing in high climate risk places, and especially those places that aren't doing anything about it or are not trying to. But on the back end of that, because of that entire thing that I was just saying about climate risk being disproportionately borne by poorer communities, if in a vacuum, all that would happen most likely would be inequality would widen. And so there's a need to actually measure from an ESG perspective, talking about that acronym I was referring to earlier, and to ensure that investors have the transparency to say, if you don't invest in this community, that's also going to hurt that community because it's a socially vulnerable community. And so it's a way of raising that sort of quantitatively raising the awareness of a set of investment constituents that are getting a mandate to start trying to figure out how to fix these problems, which I see as a good sign, but they need the tools to do it. So then on the back end of this, one thing that we're working on, and we have a sort of a proof of concept just starting in motion with Boston Water and Sewer Commission in conjunction with this water engineering company called Hazen and Sawyer is, okay, so if we're giving the investors, we're telling you how risky the city is, well, how do we give the issuers, the city's tools to do something about it? And so the proof of concept that we're working through, I'll skip straight to that. It's just kind of a screenshot of one view that the investment clients that we have will look at to understand climate risk and socioeconomics. This is an example for Winthrop in the Boston area here. But skipping to this, just at least for the moment, this just wants to kind of close the loop on the story. So the premise of this idea is that if all of the investors, long-term premise of this idea, which we're sort of going to try to prove out with this Boston Water and Sewer project, is you measure value at risk in some way that makes sense to the investment community, which we're getting there on. You measure things on a socioeconomic dimension as well, so that there's a clear, so you can make clear the relationship not only between financial, but also the social component of what an investment would do. You compare that to the baseline, no adaptation, or no investment into whatever. In this case, for this project, it's around better drainage for storms in out to 2070. Hypothetical project A and B, right? This is exactly what we're doing with them. It's instead of A and B, it's 10 different projects, and then estimate what the actual return on that investment would be in the same language that the investors of these types of entities actually speak, and build toward sort of towards a set of tools and a common currency for thinking about how to finance the climate adaptation transition, let's say. So yeah, that's the story.
Great, thank you. Appreciated getting to see another side of it all. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So why don't we do about 5 minutes for questions for Evan, and then kind of open it up a bit more. Bharat, looks like you have a question if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so this question is to Evan. I was just wondering, what is the default rate of municipal bonds, and do they have some sort of sovereign guarantee to the bonds that they issue?
Great questions. One, so the default rate, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's very small, or historically has been very small. It's like 1 or 2% or something, like less than that. And when you then go to, so there's data on things like impairment rates. So we have some data on that for the partner that we have. Let's say doing the quick math, we have about 30,000 issuers of debt, probably 1 to 2,000 of them will be cataloged as impaired, meaning their likelihood to default is higher. At the local level, those cities can like a small city could declare bankruptcy. It's happened before with large cities like Detroit. They often have it's a really overly complicated system in a lot of ways. Different states have different relationships to their counties and school districts and all this kind of stuff. It partly falls under the whole weirdness of states' rights that is the US. But the federal rule is, you can't allow a state to declare bankruptcy. Like you're not allowed to. So they can never be bankrupt. So that means, like, if a state is over obligated, then there's an unclear sort of muddy area where that hasn't ever happened before. I don't know if you guys remember, but Mitch McConnell, like last year, was trying to tell his own state of Kentucky that they should just declare bankruptcy. And then everybody was like, well, states can't declare bankruptcy. It's never happened before. There's this murky area but in terms of at the state level, yeah, there's often some kind of backstop depending on the politics and the legal arrangement within the states.
So essentially they carry a sovereign guarantee.
So in a lot of cases, yeah, they're sovereign, you mean?
Yeah, so basically if there is a default, the bondholder will be paid off.
The bondholder won't be paid out unless there's an insurance policy on the bond. And there's actually a thing called bond insurance in this area, but that's only about 8 or 9% of the market, because as you know, the common notion is that nothing defaults, and so not much is insured either, right? So if you had a wave of massive defaults, nobody would expect it and all that.
One quick interruption here. So I think for the class, I couldn't think of a better way to illustrate. This class is called Climate Science, Engineering, Adaptation, and Policy. And I couldn't think of a better way to illustrate all of that through these three threads, with sea level rise as a science driver, with Emerald 2.2 as an engineering solution, and with what Evan was mentioning as policy. I think for all of us in the panel and many others here, if you're interested, and especially Kara, I think we should think of putting this together as a science policy forum article, just what we have here. We really should. And maybe even a New York Times op-ed. I'll not leave you, Kara, so I'll be with you on this. But meanwhile, for everybody else in the class, if you could please, if it is possible, if you could please make yourself visible, just so all of us can see you. If it's a problem, I know that many of you are dialed in from all over the world. So if it's a problem with internet connection, whatever, that's fine. But if you can, just make yourself visible. We have asked many questions throughout, so that's great. We still have 10 minutes, so I'll hand it over to Kara to see if there are any broader questions. And you will get an interesting assignment to connect all the dots that you have heard here. So if you, and I think all of these will be very useful if you're thinking about war games, if you're thinking about graduate projects, if you're thinking about things that you might want to do in general. Evan, I have a separate question for you, which I don't want to answer right now because it'll be probably, you know, I mean, we can discuss this offline, but it'll be interesting for everybody else to know here that here at Northeastern, the Faculty Senate has charged us, a committee led by Professor Jenny Stephens, to come up with climate justice. I mean, it is really sad and weird if a university like Northeastern, which is interdisciplinary, has global reach now, claims to do all these things in climate, has a faculty colleague who is now in the administration, in the Joe Biden administration, if we are not doing anything. I mean, one university cannot change the world, but you have to show the way. So that was the charge that was given. And, you know, we are talking about climate justice. I'm learning a lot. And I'd be interested in all of your views at some point about how climate justice relates to both adaptation and mitigation and other challenges. So we are discussing that. So this also hopefully for the, you know, and we just this week, actually, I think we talked with Provost Madigan. So there is interest, at least, you know, to start doing something at the highest level. So I think this will hopefully cheer all you up that the university is trying to do something. Okay, Kara, over to you for the remaining few minutes.
Thank you, Professor Ganguly. And he's always trying to get me to write a New York Times op-ed. I'm like, they have to ask me to, they have to want me to do that. So I had a kind of a general question for the panelists. Since we're with a bunch of students studying climate change, it can be a pretty overwhelming thing to study. If you wanted to touch on briefly how you got into your current field and as a way to tackle climate change. I can clarify more if that doesn't make sense.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So my background is in physics and atmospheric physics and geophysics, and I was always sort of fascinated by the weather. I love storms and tornadoes and hurricanes and everything. I just think it's like destructive and horrible, but just so cool. And so as an academic, I started studying that and just tried to combine my love of physics with sort of my love of these sort of atmospheric storm events. And so as my time as an academic, I found that I was doing a lot of really important research and I really enjoyed it, but it didn't have sort of the impact that I thought my work could have, or that I could really contribute. And so that's why I sort of left Boston College and started working with Edmund at Risk. But I think just a passion for sort of environmental climate change problems is sort of a great start, and that there's so many companies now that are sort of starting to work in this space. I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of take that sort of academic knowledge and really apply it. But for me, it was just sort of a passion for sort of climate and meteorological events, with sort of this desire to sort of take that knowledge and that skill base and really apply it to something that had sort of direct real world consequences.
Thank you. Professor Hopkins, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I think my interest in this particular track, I I've always sort of been a little bit of a climate fatalist as a kid. We just kind of knew it was going to happen. I don't know exactly how I figured that out, but I certainly did. And it carried on until undergrad at MIT and then grad school. And then as I was starting grad school, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. And one thing about me is that my entire family, immediate family, is in New York City and was in that flood zone. So I was starting grad school. I had an option of several different potential projects to choose from at Woods Hole. And the coastline just suddenly became incredibly interesting because not only were the predictions of what it was going to do, for instance, in New Jersey and Fire Island, not really bearing out with what we actually saw with the storm, but also it fascinated me that afterwards, nothing happened. And so the biggest question I've been trying to answer is, how do we get something to happen? And I'm an engineer, so I have to do it using math.
Thank you. Evan, you want to go ahead?
Sure, I'll keep mine short. I don't know that I have a very coherent narrative like Carling and Julia, but similarly, I think I just got interested in it because I was like a stats person at first and didn't really care that much what I was going to do, and then realized the world was falling apart or on fire or whatever you want to call it, and started working with Auroop way back in the day. Loved doing the work academically. Got to a similar, I don't have any direct experience like Julia was saying, just got to a similar point of feeling frustrated with the fact that everybody was just kicking the can on doing something about it. And so was fortunate enough to kind of have a personality that's bent towards scheming, and yeah, that's how I kind of think of it. I don't know, and it was a great decision.
Thank you. As someone who's a couple of years post-grad and to students about some of you about to enter that, it's great to hear about y'all's paths. If we have any questions from students, or I have another one to ask, but anyone want to raise their hands or pop in, feel free. If not, that's okay too. So what you were talking about, Evan, about states and budgets, I've been hearing about that a lot with the pandemic, how state budgets were severely impacted and they only have so many limits. So I was curious for all three of you, how this pandemic has kind of informed your work with resilience. It's a different area, but it really is a global event that affects everything we're all doing.
While everybody thinks about that, the pandemic does impact for climate preparedness, emergency management in very tangible ways. So for example, in India and Bangladesh, there was this cyclone, or hurricane as it would be called here. There's a cyclone that hit in the middle of the pandemic, and that meant emergency workers were fairly restricted in how they could interact and how they could save lives and so on. But go ahead. Kara, you're muted.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, thank you. So Evan, do you want to go ahead? I see you're muted.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm not muted. Okay. Yeah, a few things. One is I think the pandemic made it clear to everybody, and for me, it's like through a certain lens of work, I guess, but clear to everybody like how really brittle the whole resilience of the country is at this point. And so like in a way it was like doubly motivating, I suppose, because it kind of brought to life like climate change can feel like death by 1,000 cuts, whereas the pandemic felt like, oh, this would be like what it would be like if it really if there was like something that was like one of these tipping points that you hear about, or if you just have these things pile up on each other. And it's interesting, it's not entirely coincidental that like a lot of the places where you see the biggest at the same time, right, say biggest like climate losses and horrible events this last couple of years are also in the places where and some of them were quieter than others, but also where the pandemic has been the worst and hit like marginalized communities the most. Like, you know, articles by the day about this, but you know, you have people in Mississippi still that don't have running water from the winter storm that was like a month ago at this point. And you know, that's a place that's vulnerable to climate risk. And so it's just like, it's, you know, it's like the great amplifier of everything. And so like a lot of what it was almost like watching a different version of what climate change was, you know, was supposed to do unfold and make you think about a lot of different things, I guess.
Yeah, I have just sort of one thing to add, which is that the pandemic really threw into sharp relief how multidisciplinary these kind of problems are. I'm from the science background. I sort of always considered that my wheelhouse, but you know, we had at the original part of the pandemic, the scientists trying to get messages across based on what they knew, and they alone can't do it. It needs to be them, it needs to be policymakers, it needs to be a well-informed public. So it really threw into sort of a clear picture how much all of this needs to come together and how much we need to sort of be working across a lot of lines to get these kinds of things done.
Thank you. Carling, if there's anything you want to add, and then I think we'll wrap up.
No, it's okay. I think Evan and Julia said it perfectly. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have
so
a last quick question to Professor Julia Hopkins. I'm actually curious how the naming process of this MRL22 came. Yeah.
Very quickly.
Got a bit curious.
Okay, very quickly. I work with two architects. They know a lot about the history of the architecture of Boston. You might know that there's something called the Emerald Necklace, which is a park that is south of the Charles River and runs down into Jamaica Plain. The Emerald Necklace was a sort of landed gentry, sort of high society kind of concept. So the Emerald Tutu is the more egalitarian, slightly more odd, I guess you could say, slightly more representative of Boston in its current state, as opposed to Boston as it was when the Emerald Tutu, or sorry, the Emerald Necklace was constructed. And that is my spiel. It's a good question though.
We're at time, so if anyone has to leave, that's okay. But if Dion, you want to ask your question briefly?
Question for three of panelists. Sorry for the extended time. Can you hear me, Kara? Okay.
And Dion, you might want to introduce us a little bit. Indonesia.
Yeah.
You're talking about Indonesia.
Yes. For Dr. Carling Hay, do you think that other thing maybe causes the sea water level rise? For example, for the groundwater undersea, etc. Just any possibilities, you know. Quick question for Dr. Hopkins. I'm curious about the tutu. So could you explain more detail about these two things deal with sedimentation? And for do you think it's possible to develop some climate price for sort of things, not only taxes? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dion. So I don't know if everyone else had this. It's okay. I had some trouble hearing Dion, so maybe we could connect you via email to ask those questions, just because.
Okay.
Would that be all right with the three of you? All right. If you want to share your email with Professor Ganguly, and then we'll connect you. Just in interest of time, and also I was just having trouble and want to make sure they sounded like great questions. Make sure you get them answered. So just want to thank all of you for being here.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Thanks to all of you for being here and for having me as part of your class. Thanks to Professor Ganguly for having me and for bringing in that bundle of joy at the end. And if there's anything else you want to add?
No, that is it. Just don't forget whom we are doing this for when you think about climate.
Thank you. And that's all. Y'all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.